Something ignited over Iran, and it wasn't just a military facility. It was a threshold, a line that had existed unbroken through decades of threats, sanctions, proxy wars, and near misses. In the span of one night, that line stopped existing. Walls of fire tore through coordinates that had been chosen with surgical precision. Secondary explosions followed, then more. The sky over Iran didn't just burn, it announced something. And what it announced is going to reshape the next decade of global politics in ways that most people won't fully understand until it's already happened. This is the story behind the story, not the footage, not the headlines, the actual chain of events, the decisions behind them, and what's now moving in the silence after the flames. There's a short list of military assets in the world that don't require explanation. When they appear, the message is already delivered before a single weapon is released. The B-52 Stratofortress is at the top of that list. First flown in the early 1950s, the B-52 has been rebuilt, updated, and modernized through every decade since. It is not a relic, it is a continuously evolved instrument of American strategic power, and its presence over a target is never accidental and never casual. It can take off from the continental United States, travel to virtually any point on the planet, execute a precision strike, and return without ever requiring a foreign airstrip. That capability alone is a message. It says, we don't need to be next door to reach you. But the B-52's real significance isn't aeronautical, it's political. Every time this aircraft has been deployed in a direct strike role, it arrived at the end of a decision chain that ran through the highest levels of government. Intelligence reviews, legal authorizations, strategic calculations weighed against diplomatic consequences. Weeks, sometimes months of internal deliberation. The bomber doesn't move until that entire process has concluded. So when it arrived over Iran, it wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the final punctuation mark on a decision that had already been made. For decades, successive American administrations had approached Iran through a doctrine of indirect pressure, sanctions designed to strangle the economy, support for regional partners who served as counterweights, covert operations that disrupted programs without leaving fingerprints, the occasional targeted strike on a specific individual. But a direct, large-scale conventional strike against Iranian military infrastructure on Iranian soil? That was a threshold that administration after administration had approached and then pulled back from. The calculus was always the same. The cost of crossing that line might be higher than the benefit. That calculus changed. And the B-52s were the announcement. Anyone can issue a denial. Governments do it reflexively, almost automatically, in the hours after a strike. Statements get drafted, press conferences get scheduled, language gets calibrated to project strength while buying time. But there is one thing that cannot be managed or messaged in real time. Thermal signatures don't lie. Within hours of the explosions, commercial satellite operators were already capturing heat maps of the affected areas. These are not classified tools available only to governments. They are commercially operated platforms that provide imagery to analysts, journalists, researchers, and intelligence services simultaneously. And what those heat maps showed was deeply revealing, not because of where the fires were burning, but because of how long they kept burning. Normal structural fires, buildings, warehouses, industrial facilities, burn intensely and then fade as the fuel source is consumed. What the satellite data captured over the Iranian strike sites told a different story. The thermal signatures remained elevated for hours beyond what a standard structural fire would produce. To anyone trained in strike analysis, that detail has a specific meaning. When a fire continues burning that long after the initial detonation, the building itself is not the fuel source anymore. Something inside it is. Rocket propellant burns that way. So do missile components stored in bulk. So does the chemical material used in warhead assembly. Dense, energetically rich military-grade material generates sustained heat signatures that a commercial building simply cannot. The satellite imagery was, in effect, a confirmation of what had been inside those walls, and it confirmed it for every intelligence service on Earth watching the same feed simultaneously. The secondary explosions that regional witnesses described added another layer of confirmation. Experienced strike analysts refer to a secondary explosion as a high-value confirmation event. It means the munition didn't just damage a structure. It reached what was stored within it. Multiple witnesses in surrounding areas reported not one large explosion followed by silence, but a sequence, a strike, a pause, then another explosion, then another. That pattern is consistent with a facility storing multiple independent munitions or propellant sources in separate hardened sections. As heat moved through the structure, it found each cache in turn. Each one detonated on its own timeline, producing that distinctive sequence of blasts that people miles away could feel through the ground. The chain reaction wasn't a side effect, it was a confirmation receipt. What burned that night had been carefully protected for years, large reinforced structures, underground access points visible in pre-existing satellite data, perimeter security configurations consistent with high-value military installations. These were not power stations, they were not logistics hubs. Cross-referencing strike coordinates with historical satellite imagery identified structures matching known Iranian military infrastructure profiles, the kind built not for efficiency, but for concealment. And the fact that they were found, packaged into a targeting list, and struck in sequence told a story about something even more damaging than the physical destruction. Military planners will tell you that the most devastating damage from a precision strike is rarely the physical destruction itself. Infrastructure can be rebuilt, weapons can be replaced, slowly and expensively, but replaced. What cannot be quickly recovered is operational security once it has been broken. Iran has spent years and enormous resources constructing a layered secrecy architecture around its most sensitive military infrastructure. Underground facilities, dispersed storage, decoy structures designed to confuse satellite analysis, strict access controls, communication protocols designed to minimize the electronic signature of sensitive programs. The entire architecture was built around a single assumption. If the location is unknown, it cannot be struck. That assumption is now gone. Somewhere in the intelligence chain that preceded these strikes, signals intelligence, human sources embedded in or near these programs, cyber penetration of procurement networks, satellite surveillance refined over years, the precise locations of these facilities were identified, verified, and compiled into a targeting package accurate enough to achieve the results that the thermal signatures confirmed. That realization lives in a different category of damage than the fires themselves. The fires represent a setback. The intelligence breach represents an existential vulnerability. Every facility that Iran believed was hidden must now be treated as potentially compromised. Every program that operated under the assumption of concealment must be reconsidered. Every communication channel, every logistics route, every procurement relationship must be audited for potential penetration. That process doesn't take weeks. It takes years. And during those years, Iran's ability to move, build, and coordinate is fundamentally constrained by the paranoia that a successful intelligence breach leaves behind. There is a military concept sometimes described as the cost of being known. It refers to the burden placed on an adversary's operations once they understand that their secrecy has failed. Even if nothing further is struck, the act of demonstrating that you know where things are changes the adversary's behavior in ways that degrade their effectiveness. They move slower, they communicate less, they disperse assets in ways that reduce efficiency, they second-guess operations that previously ran on autopilot. Iran was now paying that cost, on top of whatever it had already lost in the fires. Inside Iranian decision-making circles, the hours following the strikes produced a political environment that was simultaneously urgent and paralyzed. Two forces were pulling leadership in directly opposite directions, and both of them were dangerous. The first force came from below. Ordinary Iranians, already worn thin by years of economic pressure from international sanctions, already skeptical of a government that had consistently asked for sacrifice while promising security, were watching footage of their country's military infrastructure burn. Official messaging that framed the strikes as limited or manageable was colliding with visual evidence that was impossible to contain once it spread through social networks. For ordinary people, the fires didn't represent a strategic setback. They represented something much more personal and much more corrosive. The sense that what they had been told was protecting them had been reached and reduced in a single night. The second force came from the hardline political establishment, the faction within Iranian governance that had built its entire domestic legitimacy on the premise that Iran could absorb external pressure and respond with force whenever its red lines were crossed. For this faction, the strikes were not just a military event. They were a direct challenge to the credibility of the deterrence model that had governed Iranian strategic thinking for 4 decades. Any response short of a direct, visible counterstrike in their framing was tantamount to admitting that the model had failed. And if the model had failed, the political architecture built on top of it was fragile in ways that internal rivals would immediately exploit. Caught between a population demanding accountability and a hardline establishment demanding retaliation, Iranian leadership faced a decision matrix with no clean options. Absorb the strike silently and risk internal political collapse as both factions interpret restraint as weakness, respond forcefully, and risk triggering a second larger round of strikes against infrastructure that had just been demonstrated to be findable and vulnerable. It was a trap, and it had been built with precision. The most dangerous thing about this kind of political trap is what it does to decision-making quality. When governments face simultaneous internal pressure from multiple directions, their external decisions become less strategic and more reactive. Rationality gives way to the immediate need to manage perception. Historical analysis of military escalations shows clearly that some of the most catastrophic miscalculations in modern conflict came not from strategic intent, but from leaders responding to domestic political pressures in ways that spilled outward faster than anyone had modeled. Iran was now inside that exact dynamic. The aspect of Iran's strategic posture that receives the least nuanced coverage, and arguably carries the most immediate consequence, is what military analysts call its forward defense network. This is not a metaphor. It is a real, structured, operational architecture of armed groups distributed across the region, each maintained in a state of readiness, each connected to Iranian command through communication channels that have been deliberately designed to provide deniability while maintaining operational coordination. To the northwest, Hezbollah in Lebanon. Battle-hardened through multiple conflicts, equipped with a missile arsenal that has been quietly rebuilt and expanded over years, despite repeated Israeli efforts to constrain it. Positioned directly on Israel's northern border, capable of sustained high-volume fire in a way that no other non-state actor in the region can match. To the south, the Houthi movement in Yemen, already in an active conflict posture before the Iranian strikes, already having demonstrated to the international community that they possessed the capability to strike maritime targets in the Red Sea with precision drones and anti-ship missiles. Their operations had already forced rerouting decisions on commercial shipping and had drawn direct military responses from Western naval forces. They were not dormant, they were operational. To the east, inside Iraq, a constellation of militia groups with varying names, consistent funding, and shared ideological alignment with Iranian strategic goals. Positioned within meaningful striking distance of American military installations, key logistics infrastructure, and regional partner facilities. These groups had been responsible for hundreds of drone and rocket attacks on American forces in previous years, and they had demonstrated both the willingness and the capability to escalate when directed. Each of these groups received a communication after the strikes. The precise content of those communications doesn't surface in press releases, but the architecture was already activating. Increased movement, elevated operational readiness, signals that analysts tracking those networks began picking up in the hours and days that followed. The proxy dimension of Iran's response wasn't a future option being considered, it was already in motion. In the immediate aftermath of the strikes, every regional capital and major global power center was running the same essential calculation. Where does this go? How fast does it get there? And what is our exposure? Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, each hosting significant American military infrastructure, each economically dependent on regional stability, each sitting in geographic proximity to the conflict zone, moved quietly to elevate security postures. These governments do not broadcast their internal alert status, but the communications between them and Washington became more frequent, more detailed, and more urgent. They understand, from proximity and from history, that a conflict centered on Iran doesn't stay centered on Iran for long. It radiates toward their oil facilities, toward the shipping lanes their economies depend on, toward the airspace their commercial aviation uses. Their concern was not academic. Israel's calculation operated on a completely different logic. For Israeli defense planners, an Iran whose missile infrastructure has been degraded represents something specific. A window, not a permanent condition, but a temporary shift in the regional threat balance. Iran's ability to strike Israel directly and through proxies had been built over years specifically as a deterrent against Israeli military action. A portion of that capability had just been reduced. The question Israeli planners were working through was not whether to acknowledge that window. It was whether to use it and for what, and how quickly that window would close as Iran began rebuilding and reconstituting. That calculation had implications that extended far beyond the current strike event. Russia and China both maintained their carefully constructed ambiguity. Neither issued condemnation strong enough to constitute an actual red line. Neither extended Iran the kind of explicit diplomatic cover that would risk dragging them into a direct confrontation with Washington. They issued statements calibrated to their domestic audiences, acknowledged their relationships with Tehran, and then went very quiet. They were watching. They were measuring American willingness to escalate, American logistical endurance, and American domestic political tolerance for a prolonged military engagement in the Middle East. The data they were collecting had applications far beyond Iran. There is a narrow strip of water between the Omani coast and the Iranian shore that doesn't appear frequently in general news coverage, but whose interruption would register in the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people within days. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 21 miles wide at its narrowest navigable point. Through that bottleneck passes roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply. Every supertanker moving crude from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE, and Qatar to markets in Asia, Europe, and beyond passes through that corridor. There is no alternative route that doesn't add weeks and enormous cost to the journey. It is, in the language of strategic geography, a choke point. And choke points, in conflict situations, become weapons. Iran has threatened to close or disrupt the Strait of Hormuz on multiple previous occasions. These threats were made during periods of elevated tension, and on each prior occasion, they remained theoretical. Iran calculated that the economic damage to itself from disrupting the strait would rival the damage inflicted on its adversaries. But a post-strike Iran operating under domestic political pressure, facing a degraded deterrence posture, and needing to demonstrate visible consequence for what it had suffered, was now doing a different calculation. The energy market understood this before any official statement acknowledged it. Within hours of the strike footage becoming widely available, insurance rates for commercial shipping through the Persian Gulf region began moving upward. Lloyd's of London war risk premiums, the insurance product that covers vessels transiting high-risk zones, climbed. Tanker operators began running rerouting analyses, calculating whether the extended journey around the Cape of Good Hope was now economically preferable to the risk of transiting a potential conflict zone. Energy trading desks in London, Houston, and Singapore began pricing a geopolitical risk premium into oil futures that hadn't existed at the start of the week. The fires over Iran were already costing the global economy money, not through any additional military action, but purely through the mechanism of uncertainty, and uncertainty in energy markets compounds. Every day that the situation remained unresolved added additional premium. Every ambiguous statement from Iranian leadership, every proxy movement in Yemen or Iraq, every carrier group repositioning in the Gulf added another layer to the risk calculation that traders and operators were running continuously. The economic dimension of this conflict was not a secondary concern. For major oil-importing economies, most of East Asia, large portions of Europe, an extended disruption to Hormuz transit was not an abstract strategic problem. It was a direct threat to industrial output, inflation rates, and economic stability. The leaders of those economies were watching the same satellite imagery that the analysts were watching, and they were making their own calls to Washington, asking the same question in different languages. How far does this go? There is a phase in every major conflict escalation that rarely gets captured in real time. It happens in the gap between the last explosion and the next decision. It's the phase where diplomacy tries to reassert itself against the momentum that military action has generated, and where it almost always finds that momentum is stronger. The back-channel communications that had existed between Washington and Tehran, fragile, unofficial, mediated through third parties operating entirely outside of public acknowledgement, were now running under maximum strain. Both sides were communicating through them, but the language had changed. Before the strikes, those channels had been used to manage escalation, to pass messages that reduced the risk of miscalculation. After the strikes, they were being used to assess intent, each side probing the other for signals about what came next. Neither willing to show the full shape of their thinking, both aware that the information being exchanged was simultaneously being used and being gamed. European governments that had spent years building a fragile mediator role, the diplomatic space between American pressure and Iranian defiance, found that space had contracted significantly. When one party in a negotiation has just demonstrated the ability and willingness to strike the other directly and at scale, the entire dynamic of mediation shifts. The party that was struck must decide whether returning to any table under those conditions represents pragmatic survival or public capitulation. In Iranian political culture, shaped by decades of what the government frames as resistance to foreign pressure, that distinction carries weight that outsiders frequently underestimate. The threshold for direct military action had been lowered. That is not a temporary condition. Once a threshold is crossed and the sky doesn't fall, once the crossing itself becomes the new baseline, the next crossing requires less internal deliberation. The decision chain shortens. The political cost of action decreases because the precedent has already absorbed the shock. What the B-52 strikes established was not just a military outcome. They established a new normal for what was permissible and executable in this conflict. That new normal would shape every calculation made by every party in the months ahead. History has a way of marking certain moments as the ones that everything else traces back to. Those moments are rarely recognized in real time. They get recognized later, in the analysis that follows, when the pattern becomes visible, and the chain of causation can be traced from the present back to the night the sky ignited. The infernos over Iran may be one of those moments, not because of the fires themselves, but because of the set of conditions they created. A trapped adversary facing impossible political pressures, a proxy network already moving, an energy market already pricing an extended instability, a regional balance already recalibrating around a new threat reality, and a global order quietly reorganizing around positions that each major power was choosing carefully before the next phase arrived. The most experienced military analysts, the ones who have watched enough of these situations unfold to recognize the patterns, weren't focused on the fires when they went quiet. They were focused on the silence that followed. Because in conflict analysis, silence after a major strike isn't peace. It's a pause. It's the moment when decisions are being made in rooms that don't have cameras, by people who understand that what they choose in the next 72 hours will echo for years. The fire had done its work. The silence was gathering, and somewhere inside that silence, the next chapter was already being written.